Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. So welcome to this evening's talk by the Oxford Economics Society. We are delighted to be hosting Professor Bryan Caplan of George Mason University. He is here to talk to us about poverty and who is to blame. Remember that after the talk, if you miss any of it, you can catch up with it on our YouTube. So please like and subscribe for more of our content. And please join us tomorrow when we will be hosting Martin Wolf, the chief economics commentator of the Financial Times. So, Professor Caplan, I'm delighted to have you here with us this evening. Whenever you're ready, please take it away.
All right, thank you very much, and hello, Oxford. I am going to do everything I can to make this not a terrible, boring, hellish Zoom experience. I am always trying to figure out a way to do this better. And let's see, so there was the question of whether I should use my slides or not. So I think I'm going to try showing some slides, and then I'm going to cut back, and whatever I can to mix it up and be less boring is good in my book. I cannot actually see your faces, so that would be better if I could see whether people are bored out of their minds or not, but let's just get started here. All right. There we are. Let's see, this says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay, sorry about that. I will just... that should be fine now.
Okay, very good. All right. Okay, here we are. All right, so this is a talk which is based upon a book that I am in the process of writing called Poverty, Who's to Blame? When I presented this at the IEA, I was told that my grammar is not correct. And so, but in any case, I'm probably going to stick with the title just for euphony. All right, so what I'm going to do in this book is I'm going to try to straddle moral philosophy and social science. So I don't know if there's any PPE people over there, but I was not a PPE person myself, but I do like the general idea of blending together politics, philosophy, and economics to say something that is true and also relevant. So what I'm going to do in terms of moral philosophy is first of all flesh out a plausible moral theory of blame. And then I'm going to apply this moral theory to poverty, and especially absolute poverty. I'm focusing on absolute poverty for the reason of, well, let's see, you'll see. So England, you may have heard of Les Miserables, Jean Valjean. He stole a loaf of bread to feed his sister's son for 19 winters served his time. In any case, if you know the musical, the character does go to jail for stealing a loaf of bread, and his poverty resonates a lot more than if you'd stolen something to, say, buy a better iPhone or something like that. So that's sort of lurking in the background. Then I'm going to move on to the social science, and one thing is figure out how much of global poverty can be properly blamed on anyone. There may be a lot of poverty. This is just due to the constraints of existence. Especially during earlier times, is like what could they have done to have gotten rid of absolute poverty in 1000 AD? They just didn't have very high production then, so it would have been very hard. And then the primary culprits I'm going to talk about, first of all, third world governments for bad development policies. So I am going to argue that there are demonstrably bad development policies that have been very popular in third world countries. And if they had just not done those, then their countries would be looking much better today and there wouldn't be much absolute poverty. And secondly, I'm also going to fault first world governments for bad immigration policies. I've done a lot of other work in immigration. That was my last book, Open Borders, The Science and Ethics of Immigration. And a lot of what I say in that book is, even if your country is terrible, if you were just free to move to another country that was better, a great number of people would take care of their own poverty directly, and also through remittances would take care of a lot of the poverty of people who stay behind. But then we've also got the secondary culprits that I'm going to discuss, and this is the poor themselves for irresponsible behavior. If you look at this talk, you'll see that I only spend maybe 5 or 10 minutes on that point, and yet I found that in Q&A, about 90% of all questions are about that point. So that's fine, but remember, that's not the only thing I said. Right, so just remember, yes, I agreed with everything except what he said about the irresponsible behavior of the poor. That would be fine, but if all you remember is that, then you have sort of missed the point. All right, so thinking about the blame game briefly, and I am going to just give you the quick version of these slides to save time for Q&A, but it starts with this. Suppose A is a problem, who is to blame? And there is a whole moral philosophy of blame, but I'm just going to tell you my answers, And I'm going to argue that they're probably your answers too. Even if you have a theory that is inconsistent with the answers that you give, I'm going to say that, in fact, what you already think is something quite close to me. All right, and there's a tension with grand moral and political theories. In particular, if you were utilitarian, for example, then you can say, well, there is no such thing as blame, or really blame is at most something that we do in order to deter behavior. And yet, at least I'm going to try to convince you that that's not really how even utilitarians use the concept of blame. All right, so just going through the obvious parts. So if A's problem is literally unavoidable, then we can say, well, no one is to blame for it. It's just an unavoidable problem. But then if there are reasonable steps that A could take or could have taken, and that or could have taken part is important to avoid the problem, then we can say that A is to blame for his own problem. But then if A could have avoided his problem by taking reasonable steps and B refused to leave alone to take such steps, then B is to blame for A's problem. And then finally, what if B had nothing to do with A's problem because A's problem could solve it at a reasonable cost? Here I will stick my neck in and say B is probably still not to blame for A's problem. There's a concept in philosophy called supererogation. It's a fancy term for going above and beyond the call of duty. If you remember the story of the Good Samaritan, it's one where a guy gets beaten up in ancient Israel, and then a bunch of people walk past him, and then finally one guy, Samaritan, walks by and picks him up and helps him out. And if you read the story, basically what the Samaritan did was administer basic first aid. He then gave him transportation on a donkey to an inn. Then he paid for the guy to stay for a couple days in the end. And that's the end of the story. And yet we're still talking about the Good Samaritan, suggesting that the Good Samaritan didn't just do his basic duty. He actually did something that is morally impressive. Right? And again, if you look at that story and say, well, the Good Samaritan just did his basic duty, there's no reason to especially think that he was a great guy. If that's your reaction, then you're going to disagree with my approach. On the other hand, if your intuition is, it does seem like the Good Samaritan did indeed do something morally impressive, then you're going to be on the same page as me. All right, so that's the moral backstory. But the book is intended to combine philosophy and economics. So problem of poverty, you've all heard the basics before, I assume. So we got about 1 billion human beings a day still living in dire poverty. And actually from COVID, that's a lot more. So remember, in rich countries, often large parts of the population were just put on welfare for COVID. In the US, at least, the people that were unemployed actually were making more money than when they were working for a while. But most poor countries don't work this way. Right? Most poor countries, if you are put out of work by the government, then you have to figure out some other way of getting money, unless you're living in a city or something like that, where there may be some government programs there to prevent people in cities from revolting. But in any case, so almost 1 billion human beings still live in dire poverty, below $1.25 a day. And by the way, when I talk about the present, let the present equal 2019 because this isn't a COVID talk. So we can talk about COVID in the Q&A. Right? And of course, the absolutely poor don't just have worse phones. They face hunger, homelessness, early death. Now, there is something called hedonic adaptation, which makes this not as bad as it seems. Namely, people do get used to bad conditions. It is a very reliable psychological law that people tend to adjust. So I don't know how many of you have adjusted to COVID and you're just used to these conditions and like now you don't even mind them that much. So again, something else literature says is that people adjust much more poorly to a social situation than just to material deprivation. But in any case, so hedonic adaptation means that the poor are not as miserable as you would think, but absolute poverty is still an awful problem. And since you are at Oxford, I assume that you are not absolutely poor. So here are some memes to remind you about what absolute poverty is like. These are the first world problem memes. You've probably stayed with some of them. So I'm so hungry, but I don't want to cook. It's a problem that most people throughout history would have trouble relating to put it that way. All right. Now, who, if anyone, is to blame for the problem of poverty? So we go back to the pre-modern world. The right answer often no one, because dire poverty really is the natural state of humanity. Dire poverty is our natural state. So I'm trying to remember. So let's see. I was actually verifying the author of the quote. I thought it was Peter Bauer, but maybe this was actually, he didn't quite say it. But anyway, what people say Lord Bauer said was poverty does not have causes, only wealth has causes, which is a poetic statement. You could say, well, the cause of poverty is the lack of the causes of wealth. But anyway, the point of this is to say that for most of human history, poverty was just unavoidable for most people because we didn't produce enough stuff to not have poverty. But what we can say today is that the first world is what mathematicians would call an existence proof, that reasonable steps to avoid absolute poverty exist. It's not an absolute airtight proof because it's not absolutely an airtight proof because you might say, well, rich countries are rich because they have the best of the right natural resources or so on, but then you can go and look at other rich countries and see, no, it seems like you can still be rich without that. So anyway, the primary steps that could be taken to avoid absolute poverty, first of all, would be for third world governments to end bad development policies, and especially against multinational business, as we're going to see. But secondly, first world government should end bad immigration policies, especially against low-skilled guest workers. And then secondary steps. And again, I said the secondary steps is where people flip out. I think it is important though, so I'm going to say it anyway. Again, it does keep leading people to mishear the whole talk because it's not all about step three. Step three is one of three things that I emphasize, but still, I am going to stand by my guns here. So step three, the poor themselves should avoid irresponsible behavior, and especially impulsive sex, as we're going to see. So the irresponsible behavior that leads to very serious poverty problems, even in rich countries, generally does come down to impulsive sex because impulsive sex has a way of leading to 18 years of further financial problems. All right, so going over primary responsibility, starting with third world governments. So economic policy, as you probably know, is a choice. It's not a law of nature. You don't have to have the economic policies that you have. People sometimes say we have no choice, but that's just like saying, I can't come to your party. Yeah, you can come to my party, it's just you don't want to. Right? You've made a choice not to do so. Right? And third world governments have long chosen very badly. So of course there's old school socialism where government actually runs the economy. Then there's this expropriation, just saying, let's go and grab the resources that have already been produced. What possible harm could come from that? Which is close to the Venezuela strategy. And then there's also autarky. You're trying to cut your country off from the rest of the world. If we take a look at the data, here, this is a map of economic freedom. There's one other major measure of economic freedom. They have very similar results. So if you take a look at this map here, so economic freedom in the third world remains very low. So blue is going to be the most free. So you'll see Canada, US, England are all there. Green is the second quartile. So there you've got France, Poland, Sweden, Spain, Italy. Then we've got third quartile. There you've got Mexico, China, Soviet Union, or not Soviet Union, Russia, of course. And then we got the red areas, right? Least free. Right? You'll notice, wow, the least free areas are very concentrated in poor areas. Over here, we've got, first of all, the graph of economic freedom and income per capita. Now, if assuming that you guys have had some basic stats, you might look at this and say, well, what does that really prove? Well, nothing is intended to prove anything, but just to get you thinking, this is quite a coincidence here. So when you go and see that the most free countries have about 6 times the per capita income of the least free countries, now you might look at that and say, well, this doesn't mean that Venezuela could multiply its income 6-fold if it just switched over to really good policies this year. And that makes a lot of sense. Again, probably a better story about economic freedom is that it leads to growth. And if you have good economic freedom for a long time, then eventually it turns into a high per capita income rather than just growth. Over here in this exhibit 1.7, this is a graph showing economic growth as a function of policies. You notice there is some pattern for the first 3 quartiles, but not a really big pattern. It's for that last quartile where things look terrible, right? And again, if you just think about having a growth that is over 1.5 percentage points less than other countries for many decades, and you can see, yeah, well, of course you're going to be poor if you do that. All right. So anyway, this is just some big picture. I've been, in writing this, I've been feeling I need to read more, but still, this big picture does make a lot of sense. And especially the idea that just royally screwing up, being in that red zone, the bottom quartile, is really bad. And it's the kind of thing that is likely to just keep your country mired in poverty. Now, thinking about more specific policies, what exactly is wrong? There's still 2 1995 papers by Saxon Warner that find very interesting and striking. So what they say is that just avoiding a short and clear list of awful economic policies, which basically comes down to socialism, expropriation, autarky, is a sufficient condition for solid long-run economic growth. And again, so since you're Oxford, you know about sufficient conditions. So do this stuff, and that's good enough. So this was a quote from the paper. So quote, "There is not a single country in our sample, which covers 117 countries and approximately 90% of the world's population as 1985, which pursued appropriate policies during 1970-89, and yet which had per capita growth of less than 1.2% per year, and not a single qualifying developing country, less than 4% per capita at the time, which grew at less than 2% per year." And yeah, it's an academic paper, but they put in an exclamation point because it's not often that you get a result that strong in social science. Then some other interesting evidence. Shock therapy in the ex-communist world actually did work. So there is a lot of negativity about how terrible shock therapy was, especially at the time saying all this shock therapy, it's awful, and these countries are having major recessions, people are suffering. And yet when you come back later, you see countries that did shock therapy have done a lot better. The countries that reformed the most done the best, and the countries that took it slow, like Belarus, barely reformed at all. Right, so there's some, anyway, we can talk more about that in the Q&A. Also, recent paper by Bill Easterly saying that despite earlier doubts, liberalization worked over the long run. So what's saying? All right, then there's some parallel research on managerial quality by Bloom and Van Rieden, among others, that finds large benefits of common sense best practices in business. All right, so what they do here is they have these international surveys where they're trying to measure the quality of firm management. And again, not doing anything special like, do we want to have the Japanese style where the manager is in plain sight of all the workers, but really basic things like, do you keep track of whether workers are showing up on time? Do you keep track of inventory? Do you do pay performance? So the very most basic common sense principles of management and measuring whether they're followed. And you might think, well, doesn't everyone do the common sense stuff? And one big result of Bloom and Van Rieden is no, actually, there are a lot of poorly managed firms in the world. But then they have some other striking results. So one is that government firms are very, very poorly managed, right, which fits with what is so bad about socialism. But secondly, they find the poorer the country, the worse the management. So firms in poor countries are just poorly managed. And they find that actually explains a lot of the lower productivity in poor countries. It's just that their businesses are mismanaged. But then they give a really neat result. There's one exception. There's one kind of business that is run to first world standards in the third world, and that is multinationals. So multinational businesses basically have the software of running firms well, and they go to other countries, and when they set up their firms there, they sort of download the software, and they then at a very low cost, they're able to go and take the cutting edge of high quality management and make it happen in poor countries, which is striking because, of course, multinationals are generally the firms that are treated with suspicion or hostility in poor countries. Right. So over here on the right, we just have some graphs showing average management scores for both domestic and foreign firms. So one is you can see how the richer countries have better domestic firms. But again, take a look. The foreign multinationals, their quality of management varies much less. And you'll notice it's higher across the board. Multinationals just are better at taking the raw materials and turning it into something good. All right, so that's a quick version of the policy of domestic countries. And again, you could think of what I'm saying as a series of nested arguments. The first one saying there'd be very little absolute poverty if third world governments had just had decent policies for a long time, or at least non-idiotic policies for a long time. But secondly, even if they had those idiotic policies, next step, if first world countries would allow immigration, then people would just walk away from the worst countries and would escape poverty that way. So as you know, all first world countries heavily restrict low-skilled immigration. There have been some standard estimates where economists have tried to calculate what would the global economy look like if anyone could get a job anywhere, right? And rough estimate is that open borders would be something like doubling world production, right? And it is totally reasonable to think this massive increase in production, which has been called trillion-dollar bills on the sidewalk, would overwhelm any distributional effects, right? Because it's one thing to say that for a new kind of steel production might go and ruin towns that stick to the older kinds, right? Because it's a very particular increase in production. But if you look at any major increase in production that happens in a lot of different areas, those have very clearly been good overall, with very moderate distributional effects by comparison. So if you're asking like, who is worse off today because of the Industrial Revolution? Who's worse off today because of the internet? It's no, like, again, it's one thing to say, wouldn't it be great for travel agents if there hadn't been any internet travel agency? All right, yes, but what about the internet overall? Has that not been a net benefit even for travel agents? All right. Now, holding scale constant, these immigration restrictions often will drastically reduce third world workers' income, often by a factor of 10 or more. Right? So here in the US, I always talk about what happens the day that a Haitian shows up in Miami. And it is totally realistic for a Haitian to think he's going to earn 10 times as much in the US as in Haiti. And again, it's not because Americans are nice and Haitians are mean. It's because the Haitian just has much higher productivity here. All right. Now, of course, there is a lot of resistance to this idea and saying, well, look, fine, I thought you were going to do moral philosophy, but how is this our responsibility? Right? If third world countries are messed up, that is the fault of the third world countries themselves. And I will say, I think there is a long intellectual tradition that unreasonably blames first world countries for failing to solve third world poverty with foreign aid. It says, look, you're rich. Why didn't you just give enough money so people are taken care of? And the direction there is, look, even if that would work, and there's a lot of doubt about that because there's many a slip between giving money to a third world government and the money actually reaching people in need. But even so, I'd say that's just an unreasonable complaint about someone saying, look, you're rich, you could have helped them, you didn't, so you're bad, right? So say, well, I can see you saying that I was really good to help them, but why am I bad to not help them? That seems to be a rather high burden that almost no one would actually accept in real life. Anyway, so what I went up saying with regards to immigration is that this tradition is actually right for the wrong reason. So lack of state-to-state charity is not culpable. But on the other hand, this draconian regulation of the international labor market actually is. Right, by the way, these pictures are taken from my book on immigration, which actually is a nonfiction graphic novel. So fun reading, especially for COVID. And if you've got other people in your family, out of all my books, this is the only one I've ever heard of family members fighting to read. So of course you can buy multiple copies and solve that problem, right? Okay, right now, really, so yes, how can immigration restrictions cause so much poverty? The answer is because they trap so much talent in low productivity countries. Then there's, of course, a whole lot of complaints about immigration, which we can do in the Q&A. But this book does argue that complaints are greatly overrated. And in Poverty to Blame, I'm going to double tap on immigration and go back to the topic and spend some more time on it. All right, so, all right, and then the secondary responsibility. Like I said, this is where people generally start getting antsy or even agitated or upset. And when I did this at the IEA, there were definitely some people in the audience who were unhappy about this part. And you could tell from their tone of voice, but let's see. So I guess all my questions come through chat here, right? So if you want tone of voice, you'll have to go and give some stage direction, like tone of voice, agitated, and then read the question. And then, in any case, I do say if third and first world governments stopped causing poverty, there wouldn't be much absolute poverty left, but some would remain. Why? So one is just bad luck. So sometimes there's bad luck in life, right? But then another reason is irresponsible behavior. Right now, philanthropists have traditionally distinguished between the deserving and undeserving poor. So just as a matter of language, deserving equals you don't deserve to be poor, and undeserving equals you do. Now, this rhetoric has fallen very much out of favor. Here in the US, we think of it as very Victorian, right? So I doubt that you hear this very much in England. Definitely when I presented this, no one gave any indication they thought this was an English way of looking at poverty. But nevertheless, here in the United States, we think of this as the old-fashioned Victorian outlook of 19th century England, Scrooge-like. Anyway, so the rhetoric has definitely fallen out of favor. It's not often that a politician will say, we need to distinguish carefully between the deserving and undeserving poor, but we still do believe it. When someone pleads for your help, say a friend shows up and says, I need to sleep on your couch tonight. Imagine this isn't COVID. All right. You naturally do want to know, well, why? Why? What happened exactly? Right? You might not want to pry, but on the other hand, it's like it's relevant. If you're thrown out of your house because you're an abusive spouse, then maybe you should be sleeping on the street. Why is it that I should have to go and help you out? On the other hand, perhaps if you're fleeing an abusive spouse, then it's, oh my God, you poor person. You didn't deserve this. Nobody does. All right. Now, so you naturally want to know why they need your help. And again, the way that I suggest framing this is, were there reasonable steps that A could take or could have taken to avoid poverty? right? Were there things that you could have done at reasonable cost that would have prevented this problem from emerging in the first place? All right, so now what would be some reasonable steps? Here I'm just going to present some that seem obvious enough to me. Here's one: work full-time even if the best job you can get isn't fun. It's a friend who wants to live with you rent-free and eat your food, and you say, wait, why is it you can't get a job? And they say, well, the best job I can get is no fun. Doesn't seem like a very good excuse to you, I presume. I mean, of course, as in all philosophy, you can simply bite bullets and just say, yeah, I think that no one should have to do any job that isn't fun. And at that point, I might ask a few more probing questions, but if you could just stick to your guns and just say, nope, 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 and then we have no common ground and we can't get any further on the moral philosophy, of course, we could still discuss the social science. Okay, so one reasonable step is to work full time, even if the best job you can get is not fun. Another reasonable step: spend your money on food and shelter before cigarettes and cable TV. Right. So if there's someone who says that I need to go and sleep on your couch and I don't have money for rent, but they have a lot of money for cigarettes, you could reasonably say there's something odd here. You seem to have money for these things that you want, but you don't have money to go and contribute, and you want to sponge off of me. Right. And here's another big one: use contraception if you can't afford a child. So if you are not ready to take care of a child, then use contraception. So note I didn't say abstinence is a reasonable step, it's just using contraception. Right? Reliable contraception exists, it's cheap. Now, in rich countries, following these steps lets able-bodied adults reliably avoid absolute poverty. So as far as I know, the research that I'm drawing on has only been done for the US. Someone needs to do it for the UK if it hasn't been done yet. I haven't heard of anyone doing it for the UK. I really want someone to do it for Japan, actually, for reasons we can discuss in the Q&A. In any case, so this body of research is called the success sequence, and it says, look, there is a trifecta of 3 very easy behaviors where if you do all of them, then you are almost certainly not going to be living in poverty. All right, so the poverty rate for Americans do the following: 1, finish high school; 2, work full time; 3, marry and wait until 21 to have children, is only 2%. Poverty rate for those who do none of these is 77%. All right, now when you look more closely at numbers, you'll see that non-work is the main proximate cause. So the really biggest effect is from people who just don't work, and people who don't work are likely to be in poverty. However, when you look more closely, you'll see that impulsive sex is usually the root cause. Because you have impulsive sex, this means that you are likely to become a single parent, and it's super hard for a single parent to work, especially to work full time. All right, so again, this is a case, of course, where once you have the child, then you might say, I don't have a reasonable way of avoiding this, but then, well, you could have planned ahead. All right. So in any case, this is true for the US, and further work has confirmed this. Now, again, of course, if you are a social scientist, you might be saying, well, this is merely correlational. I would just say, if you just look at those, you will see there's no way this is merely correlational. Right. So obviously, for full-time work, to say it's just a coincidence that people full-time work are not in poverty, right? That's pretty ridiculous. Again, for finishing high school, pretty ridiculous. Right? You can't get a better job when you have more education. And I wrote a whole book on this. So yes. And then finally saying it doesn't impede your career to be a single parent. Again, come on, that's crazy. All right. Now, even in poor countries, responsible behavior at least makes absolute poverty far less likely. So there's some interesting work by Banerjee and Duflo, who won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago, saying in poor countries, saying this: the global poor spend around 5% of their income on alcohol and tobacco, and 10% on festivals. Weird. Wow. So you actually don't have enough calories, but you're spending money on these other things. Again, a part of it, when people look closely, is dads spending money on alcohol and tobacco and prostitutes while their kids don't have mosquito nets. Right. There was a column by liberal columnist Nicholas Kristof, who went and did a tour of Africa and came back and wrote this, quote, if the poorest families spend as much money educating their children as they do on wine, cigarettes, and prostitutes, their children's prospects would be transformed. Much suffering is caused not only by low incomes, but also by short-sighted private spending decisions by heads of households. All right, now, like I said, even though I do discuss 3 main blameworthy causes of poverty, 95% of questions about this talk just attack the moral philosophy or the science of there being a poverty irresponsibility link. So the slogan is, look, you're blaming the victim. Right now for this, I'll say, look, it is true by definition that you should never blame the victim. However, who is the victim? Is the victim always the person who is suffering the most? It's crazy. Right? So I suppose you're an arson investigator. Does this mean you should never go and investigate the person who has been burned over half their body? Like, there's a totally natural person to investigate for an arson. So you're blaming the victim. Well, we don't know if he's a victim or not. Right? The very fact that he's burned, at least we should look into it. Maybe the arsonist burned himself trying to start the fire. In which case, how is he a victim? He started the fire, right? And it's like, well, he's a victim because society drove him to it. Like, oh, brother. Like, that's going to be your standard victimhood. If that's your standard, then there's really there's almost no point talking about it, because you're going to come up with some lame excuses regardless. Right now, just some non-fanciful hypotheticals. Suppose you have a dad who spends money in alcohol and prostitutes when his kids are hungry. Did he do wrong? Right now, you might say, well, I have a moral philosophy that says that we should never blame this guy, but do you actually think that he's not to blame? What if you go and talk to his family and they totally think he's to blame? Are you going to say, no, you're wrong, he's a victim? Like, how is he a victim? He's the one spending money in alcohol and prostitutes while the kids are hungry, right? Or how about this one? A couple who can barely support themselves routinely have unprotected sex. Right? Very likely to end in a situation where they're not able to take care of it, right? Or how about this one? An able-bodied adult lives from crime when the unemployment rate is 3.5%. Say, well, gee, what choice do I have? Well, seems to be very easy to get a job, and yet you're still committing crimes to get money. So, so if in these cases the people are not to blame for their own poverty, who is? Who is? All right. And finally, let me say, so there are a lot of people just say, well, we just shouldn't talk about blame. I put it in the title of my book because I do want to talk about it. I'll say on a micro level, almost everyone thinks that blame morally matters. So there's a line from Homer Simpson, we can sit around all day arguing about, like, who was drunk at work, right? Who cheated on who, or who crashed whose car, right? And when you hear these excuses, we recognize them. These are transparently the attempt of someone who is parasitizing on others and taking advantage of them to avoid the normal consequences. And in real life, virtually everybody does this, including the most hard-boiled utilitarians. In real life, they do sit around blaming people for things and allocating their help on the basis of who they think actually deserves it. But yes, at the macro level, there is still a high status view that says blame doesn't matter. We should only worry about the effectiveness of solutions. Right? So we don't need to talk about exactly why it is that people are poor. So if you say, look, a lot of poverty is due to impulsive sex, then you say, well, do you have a way of reducing that? If not, then we shouldn't talk about it. So the core premise of my book is that blame matters. Blame affects a bunch of things. It affects what counts as a social problem. So someone says, look, I don't have a girlfriend. Is that a social problem at all? Is it something that other people need to worry about? I say, look, that's your responsibility to take care of that. If you're not happy with the situation, you have to figure out a way to make yourself more appealing in the dating market so that you can get what you want, right? Or someone says, look, I can't find a job that I don't get fired when I'm an alcoholic. Well, so is that actually a social problem? Maybe it is a problem for you that you should improve your behavior, right? Blame also affects who's morally obliged to change their behavior. When people argue about blame, the subtext is once you admit that you are to blame, then you're the person that has to change and repent and reform, right? And then blame also affects who should be shamed for failing to change their behavior. So whose side should strangers take in the conflict? I will say if blame really doesn't matter, then why is the blame game so acrimonious? Why is the people actually argue about this so much? Finally, I'll point out, so even thinkers who officially oppose blaming people for bad behavior normally continue to blame at least one bad lifestyle. So these are two different quotes from Paul Krugman. I assume you guys know who Paul is. Very smart, interesting guy. So first quote, nobody, not William Julius Wilson, not Larry Mitchell, not yours truly, denies the bad effects of reduced opportunity would be much less if people always did what was in their best long-term interests. But people often don't, which is why loss of economic opportunity can be socially as well as economically destructive. That's not crude materialism. It's saying that people are human. So someone loses his job and then takes a drink. That's people are human. No, move along, nothing to see here. But then a year later, he wrote, quote, maybe I actually am right, and maybe the other side actually does contain a remarkable number of knaves and fools. So he's not willing to go and take excuses from Republicans of saying, gee, don't blame me. My parents are Republicans. So naturally, I believe this stuff too. It's not my fault if it's terrible. Paul is not going to take that excuse from you. For if you have different political views than him, he will hold you the standard of you ought to go and study the issues carefully and not just go and embrace something that a demagogue told you that made you feel good about yourself. You have a responsibility as a human being to think things through clearly, but he doesn't want to say the same thing for someone that practices irresponsible behavior, which leads to poverty. And I say, use right the second time, right? Yes, blame people, right? Someone goes and works and says, yeah, I believe in the QAnon conspiracy theory. It's like, how would you even begin to think that's true, right? Like, were you there? Right. And like, it seems like something you had to be highly intellectually responsible in order to believe. And that is blameworthy. Don't do that. Okay. All right. Now, is this the whole story? No way. So I say the main lesson of reading about poverty for over a year is every simple theory of blame is wrong. So like, I really desperately wanted during this time to talk about the horrors of housing regulation, but there wasn't time. But housing regulation is terrible, and it drastically increased the price of housing. And it would be very affordable for people to have a nice house in London if you could just go and build skyscrapers everywhere. But that's illegal. And that's why it's so expensive to live there, right? But there are still some factors that overshadow others. So like I said, so absolute poverty would be almost gone if third world governments had adopted decent economic policies 50 years ago. So even so, absolute poverty would be almost gone if first world governments allowed people to escape from third world countries. And even so, absolute poverty would be greatly reduced if the poor lived responsibly. So I'll stop there. And now we will switch over to, let's see, hold on here. Let's see, having trouble. Let's see, right. Let's see, there we are. I need to do stop share. Okay, everybody. All right, so happy to go and take questions now. So I guess they're all going to get filtered through our host.
Yeah, brilliant. So we'll kick things off with someone's asked, could you be more precise on what socialism means? High taxes, authoritarian government, high regulations?
Yes. So that's a great question. So when I said old school socialism, that means actual Soviet style socialism where the government runs directly at least a very high share of the economy. So now, so if you go ahead and look at that economic freedom of the world, the red, so definitely if you are socialist, you will be red unless you're so oppressive that there's no data, in which case you get to be gray, right? So I think North Korea actually isn't red on that diagram, even though it is probably the least free economy in the world, because it's such a tyranny that there's no numbers that really come out. And so it gets coded as nothing, even though we know basically what's going on there. But anyway, so that's what I would say for old school socialism. I mean, actually looking like the Soviet Union, where government runs most of the economy. Now, do you have to be that in order to count as socialist? I would say, well, then it's a continuum. Like, so we definitely know that counts as socialism. And then for other things, like how far would you have to go? Like what's the cutoff? Is it 51% of the economy has to be directly run for the government? I would say I don't know. What the right cutoff is. Again, there's inevitably some arbitrariness. In a way, what's nice about doing those economic freedom of the world statistics is that it gives you a continuous measure. And so you can say, well, if you're really at the bottom, then you're going to be like the Soviet Union or something like that. Bottom quartile, you may not be the Soviet Union, but it's still going to be one where there's a very heavy role of government. You'll notice, for example, that countries like Sweden come out as being in the second from the top in the quartile. So they've got more than their government is more than enough constrained to be in the top half anyway. So the countries that are in that bottom quartile, there's a very large role for government indeed. I know in the case of Venezuela, people have pointed out, well, actually their government doesn't run that large of a share of GDP. There was a large increase. What we can say about countries like Venezuela, and which is one of the other markers, is what share of investment is done by government. So in Venezuela, government does almost all the investment, or at least almost all the legal investment. So that might be another good way of thinking about it. And distinguishing between just having a big welfare state versus actually having this very active role. If government is basically taken over almost all investing, then even if they don't actually run that, a huge share of the businesses, this means that basically nothing new ever happens except that the government funds it. So that's a way of thinking about it.
Okay, brilliant. So another question that's been submitted is, how is impulsive sex an applicable concept, especially where sex education and abortion are mostly non-existent in the global South?
Right. So there is actually a view in the United States that here the poor just don't know about contraception. Actually, the result from research is the opposite, and the poor know more. Like poor teenagers know more about contraception than middle-class teenagers. The idea that contraception is just not available in the third world, again, it's just false. So there might be able to find a remote village, but I mean, here's something to notice. Beer finds its way, even to remote villages. It's not like every small area has a distillery. What happens is alcohol gets made in places with actual factories, and then it gets exported there because there's demand. Right. So, and again, of course, notice also contraception is generally not spoil. So this is one where you can do, like, even if there were not middlemen that are bringing it for sale, you can do one trip to a center and stock up. So, and again, it being cheap, it's not that hard to do, especially compared to other costs. And again, to say they just have zero spare money, this is just not true. Researchers find that even the very poor do have quite a bit of money they're spending on discretionary stuff. So I would say that as well. I'd also point out there is non-reproductive sex, so known by many teenagers. And there was some question in the history of anthropology: are there really any human beings on Earth who don't know that sex causes pregnancy? I think there were some anthropologists who went to the South Pacific in the 1920s, and they came back and said, "I found some people who don't know this." And then researchers went back a couple days, like decades later, and they found people saying, "I couldn't believe how gullible those first researchers were. We told them we didn't know. Ha ha, how funny." So that is, I think, what's really going on. Again, of course, would it be easier if they could just migrate to the first world? Obviously, right? But again, the idea that it's just that people in poor countries are unaware that sex causes pregnancy or that contraception is unaffordable, right? Again, like possibly in some very rare circumstances, but it is just too quick to say that that's not possible. It is possible.
Okay. And another one that's been submitted is rich countries are rich because they exploited colonial resources and invested in industrialization with them. Is step 3 really adequate, even if it blames poor countries for their own situation?
Right. So I would just claim. So, I mean, notably, there are some European countries that did not have any overseas colonies of note, and yet they're still doing fine, and they were not lagging behind before. So, Sweden, Switzerland, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I guess you might say that the non-Austrian parts were the colonies, but so just take a look at it. It's a little bit hard to understand. Like, well, if that were the source, then why are these other countries doing comparably? When researchers have actually tried to see were colonies even a net positive, economically speaking, generally, so probably Belgian Congo was, but overall, it looks like normally colonizing powers spent, the government, they put a lot more money investing in the countries than they ever were able to get out of it. And particularly because you want to remember that, especially during this era, just because you're a colonial power does not mean that you are the only one that gets to trade there. And on the other hand, just because you're not the colonial power doesn't mean that you can't trade there. And so, like, one of the main places the British invested in the 19th century was Chile, right? So India, I think actually, definitely per capita did not get very much. So, say, well, then why were they doing it? If it wasn't for these economic gains, I'd say, well, how about nationalism, militarism? Remember those things that almost everyone says caused World War I? Also probably caused colonialism as well, right? It's the pride of coloring in the map and saying we don't want to be behind these other countries. They've got colonies. Why can't we have colonies, right? And then we need to assert ourselves and puff up our great might. Which I say also, like, once you have this totally symbolic view of what colonialism was about, it explains why it was so easy for Europe to get rid of its colonies after World War II, which was they were never an important part of their economies in the first place, right? If you just say, like, how can like losing all of British India not be a big deal for the UK? It really wasn't, right? So it wasn't that big of a trading partner. And again, in terms of what the British were getting out of it, economically, quite unclear. Of course, there may be a few particular Britons that are getting a lot out of it, especially if you get your factories expropriated in India once they're independent. But again, it was not a overall positive, except in maybe some very special cases. In terms of, now again, you might say, look, even though it wasn't a net positive for the colonial power, it might still be a net negative for the colonized power. And that's one where I would say it varies quite a bit by country. Right. So, as you probably know, the British have a better reputation for having done things that actually helped the countries they were colonizing. And you might, that's disputed, but least I think they say it is an open question. In a way, I might say that the main way that the British are responsible for, say, Indian poverty was having a whole bunch of Indian intellectuals go and get terrible Fabian economic education in the UK during that time. And they took their ideas back home. In that sense, but again, it seems hardly fair to blame you guys today for what the Fabians said in the 30s. So it's most of my reaction anyway.
I suppose sort of following on from that though, what about in instances, specific instances wherein there was sort of this direct expropriation of resources? If we take India, for instance, like it is true that resources from India were expropriated, maybe not for the benefit of Britain economically as a whole, but for the benefit of certainly a few within Britain. And so obviously, yes, this was in the past, and there are questions, obviously, is it applicable to us today? But nonetheless, assuming sort of that responsibility can carry over generations, I mean, obviously, you could dispute that potentially. Is there not sort of that duty there that Britain ought to sort of foot the bill for India, if you will?
Right. So again, I mean, I would need to look into the facts more. You know, like even in cases where people say they were only there to exploit resources, sometimes, of course, this means that you come in with some guys with guns and you round up slaves and you just start digging. But that's one thing. Belgian Congo, very typical there. But very often what's going on under colonialism is that there's some resources that no one's doing anything with. And then foreign investors come and show the natives how to actually do it. And they set up functioning businesses that actually are a net benefit. So, I mean, one striking thing about resources, we sort of think of them as just being there for the taking, but there's been some interesting research on countries where people that find resources are able to keep them, seem to discover a lot more resources, which makes a lot of sense, right? So if you know that if you find resources, the government will just grab it and say it belongs to all the people, then what's the point of actually doing prospecting for resources? On the other hand, if you know that it's finders keepers, then it's going to be a different matter. So that's something else to keep in mind. Again, I would say that if you do want to focus on any kind of remedial measures, again, the really obvious one is let people from third world countries come work in first world countries. This is one where we don't need to worry about intergenerational justice. This is a bad thing that people in first world countries are doing to people in third countries right now, saying, you know how there's much better jobs you'd be getting? Well, it's illegal for you to have those jobs. So I always say, like, why not focus on something that is much more straightforward, that doesn't require a great depth of exploring sticky questions. We can say, look, there's some people in Haiti that want to come and get jobs, and your laws say they can't. Why not get rid of that law so they can go and do it, and then they can solve their own poverty problem, right? Which I would say is not only more immediate, but also just much more effective. Again, just to understand how minimal foreign aid is in the big scheme of things. So, I mean, most rich countries could start spending 10 times as much on foreign aid, and it still would only be a moderate part of their budget, right? Whereas the losses that the economists estimate from limiting labor mobility are many times bigger than that. Again, because basically, just think about this. If there is a Haitian earning $1,000 a year in Haiti and you can earn $26,000 a year in the US, like every year, those regulations are destroying $25,000 for that guy. It's like 40 years of that, you've taken $1 million from a Haitian. Like, how can you take $1 million from a Haitian? They don't have $1 million. Well, you've taken $1 million from what he could have if he were able to go and sell his labor in a free market.
How realistic do you think, sort of, obviously you've made a pretty compelling case for the removal of sort of immigration restrictions, but how realistic do you think it would ever be that might be achieved in the face of, I suppose, nationalist pressures, right, domestically, specifically, obviously, from more developed countries, so thinking Western Europe and America?
So, of course, it's also very unrealistic to think that rich countries will start giving any significant amount of money to poor countries, regardless of the justice of it. In terms of the realism of it, I would say actually the European Union is the most impressive case of labor market deregulation that I know of. Of course, after Brexit, the UK exited, right? Although I would also say the main benefit of the EU is the labor mobility. So, I mean, you guys have lost out, I think, but nevertheless, if you hadn't liberalized labor markets, maybe you wouldn't have left. But then again, the benefit would be much smaller. So, better to have labor market deregulation for the rest of Europe and for you guys to be out of the EU than to have the EU intact and not have that deregulation, which is such an enormous gain. In terms of how realistic it is in the short run, yeah, I think it's highly unrealistic. Over the medium run, well, so here is something that I know is true for the US. There has been a very large increase in support for more immigration over the last 20 years in the US. So for most of polling history, under 10% of Americans supported more immigration. So it was essentially a rounding error, right? And now that has got up to about a third. So in 20 years, we've gone up by about 20 percentage points, about a percentage point per year. This is support only for more immigration rather than open borders or anything radical. But still, I do think that the direction that we're moving in is probably towards more liberalization. And again, a lot of this is generational replacement of the older generation is just more xenophobic, younger generation is less so. And so when they die and you'll replace them, then I think that deregulation will proceed. I'm trying to remember, I think I might have done a Twitter poll on whether the UK will rejoin the EU in the next 25 years. Seems plausible you will, actually, since it was so close and there's such an age gradient there. Now, what is my actual prediction? My actual prediction is that the world will have open borders in about 200 years back, by the point when it no longer will do that much good anymore. Because again, the main gain from opening borders is when you open the border between countries with very different wages, right? So opening the border between two countries that are both equally rich, there's some gains to that, but it's not very much. Opening the border between a country where you have a lot of talented workers that are trapped and not able to realize their potential, that's where the real gains are at, right? And again, if you think, well, how many talented workers are in the third world? Again, what researchers do is they see, well, what actually happens if we do the experiment of bringing a randomly selected patient into the US, and you can see, wow, even there, yes, they don't earn the average American income, but they do earn way more than they would in Haiti, and not just twice, 10 times.
Okay, thank you very much. That was an interesting answer. Changing tack slightly, obviously something that you didn't mention is the rich within wealthier countries as a group even with no responsibility. Obviously, someone might flip that and say, well, if you look, you see overconsumption of resources across the rich, eating more than needs be, consuming more electricity than needs be, etc., etc. Do you think they hold any responsibility for what happens for the existence of poverty in other countries, but also their own absolute poverty in their own countries, because it's coming off the back of effectively sacrifices of the poor?
Yeah, so honestly, my view is, if any, very little. So again, this coming, sort of the moral heart of the book is with common sense morality, which is where I think that effective moral reasoning starts. It's so if you had a friend who had twice as much as you did and he didn't give you anything, would you consider him to have mistreated you or robbed you or exploited you? Saying no. Why would I? It's well, so if there's some really rich stranger who hasn't helped you at all, has he done something bad to you? So that's where you'd have to actually say, well, how did he get his money? How did he get his money? So if he got it by, say, going and having a fake bank and then taking deposits and then running away, then you say, sure, that rich guy is responsible. But of course, normally people complain about the rich. This is really irrespective of how they got their money, right? And I'd say that's the only path where it would really make sense to blame them, is if we could show that they got their money in some kind of an unproductive or exploitative or coercive way. So if, for example, you became rich because it was illegal for anyone to compete with your business, then I can totally see that story. Although again, there it's well, step one is just to get rid of the monopoly and say they do have to compete. In the United States, it turns out that a lot of the rise in inequality just boils down to to housing regulation, which has led the price of housing in the highest paid areas of the country to skyrocket. And so if you just look at non-housing wealth, there has been very little change in that kind of inequality. So again, if that's the story, then you say, well, we should go and have a special tax on people who own property in San Francisco, New York. Yeah, or you could deregulate housing so that the price comes back down and people can afford to live in these areas again. Right. So again, one of the things I'm going to be saying is that people are very quick to think of ways to rationalize the way that we already do things instead of thinking about what would be the most sensible remedy given the problem. So if the problem is precisely that government has actively caused poverty, then the obvious thing is for government to stop doing that. right? And then you might say, well, okay, we totally stopped doing that now. What about some kind of compensation for the losers? All right, but I'd say just to keep focused on if there are regulations that are causing poverty in this unjustified way, then the attention should be on getting rid of those, which also I said, really should be politically unifying. So, redistribution is inherently going to be contentious and it will always be seen as being ideological. We're saying, how about we go and we deregulate housing so that poor people can afford to live in London, right? Something where it's just different from the kind of policy people would normally recommend. And it seems like something that people from a wide range of philosophical views could support. And you could say, hey, look, so I'm not asking for handouts. Why don't we just have a free market here, which would then be better for the poor as well as for anyone else who wants to buy housing who doesn't own it. So that is a lot of the focus that I'm going to put into the book, is just a rethinking of the problem. And right now, I would say that most people think about poverty and it's like, how can we use redistribution to solve this problem? And it is like the classic, when your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I say, look, very often, in fact, normally the obvious thing is just to take some bad laws off the books so that people can solve their own problem.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. I think we've got time for one more question that's been submitted, I guess kind of touching upon what we've already discussed a little. But what do you think is the net effect of high-skilled immigration on poverty?
Yeah, so net effect of high-skilled immigration on poverty is almost certainly positive, not for both the receiving and sending countries. Receiving countries is pretty obvious because those high-skilled immigrants, they sell what they're producing mostly to lower skilled people in the country. So, and basically, if there's any wage effect, they're bringing down the wages of higher skilled workers, so leading to more equality. The main issue people have is what about the people left behind? But if you look at the amount of remittances that people in rich countries send back, or the immigrants to rich countries send back home, it's clear that that's an enormous amount of money they're sending back. So even if you directly lose the skills, you still are getting so much. You think about it, it's really a lot like someone commuting into the city to make money, where like what does it do for your family back in the suburbs when you drive into London or take the tube into London to make money? It's like it doesn't impoverish them. It's their way of getting money. It works a lot better than you living nearby and making a much lower paid job. So people also wondered about things like, what about medical professionals leaving poor countries? So I think this is a big thing with the British National Health Service, right? As you hire a whole lot of foreign medical workers, right? So what most of the research on this has said that even when countries send out a lot of medical workers, the very fact that you could get a job, that you have the potential to get a foreign job if you get a medical degree, means that a lot more people in those countries do it. And that ultimately means that there's actually greater availability of health services in the poor country too, because a lot of those health workers won't actually get the work visas to leave. So there's a famous paper on the Philippines saying, look, it's true that a lot of people with medical and nursing degrees leave the Philippines in order to go and get higher pay abroad. But the very fact that there is this lottery ticket means that a lot more people in the Philippines go and study medicine, which means there's actually higher availability in the Philippines than there would be if you didn't have that lottery ticket. So it's actually a really good deal. Although, finally, if you are worried about brain drain, again, the solution is to say that poor people can migrate too, not to say that low skilled workers can migrate too, not to say that high skilled workers can't migrate either.
Okay, brilliant. Well, I think that's all we have time for. So, Professor Caplan, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you very much. I wish I could have seen your faces to see whether people were happy or angry or bored out of their minds. It's very hard to know what to say when you cannot see the face of anyone you're talking to. But anyway, so if anyone that is listening, when things are finally back to normal, you want to meet up, if you come to DC, I will buy you lunch. And actually, I'm supposed to be at Oxford this summer from mid-July to late August. So I'm giving some seminars there, assuming things are back to normal. So if you want to meet up, let me know. All right. So good meeting you, even though I have no idea who you are or how many people are out there. All right, but bye. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Professor. And just before we leave you, just remember, again, just a quick reminder, if you want to go back and see previous talks that we've held, go check out our YouTube page where they are all posted. And also remember to join us tomorrow for the Martin Wolf talk. So thank you very much, Professor. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining.